Welcome back to Final Fantasy. We are in the middle of the waterfall cave on our way to do something here. I think we talked to the person to give us some context for why we are here. I assume so anyway. Usually I'll talk to people in this game just to get some sort of story out of the experience, because so much of this game's plot is optional, and you kind of have to go out of your way to really know what's going on. Normally when you're playing through the game, you would be doing that anyway, because you need to be talking to people to figure out what to do. But if you already know what to do, then you start to realize that a surprising amount of this game's storyline is completely optional, which is kind of strange. But it is what it is. It's kind of a good thing because it means if you're replaying the game, the experience can be a lot smoother. But it also subtracts a lot from replaying the game because it feels like if you don't do that stuff, then it feels like you're losing a lot of the experience by not experiencing the story. But going so out of your way to experience the story when it's so optional can make the story inherently or intrinsically feel tedious to experience, and thereby making it a less enjoyable aspect of the game. We just gained a level up, but I digress because that's just rambling. Which is usually how these videos tend to start, as I'm kind of getting into the groove, just talking about this or that to either set the mood or kind of get myself going before getting into the main attraction, as it were. Kind of warming myself up, you could say. Anyway, today we are going to be continuing and possibly concluding the long drawn-out top 10 that we have been working on throughout the course of this series. We're at the final 2. Last time we discussed Final Fantasy XIII as my third favorite Final Fantasy game, at least within the limits of this list. Would it be number 3 though? Like, if I were counting all Final Fantasy games, would Final Fantasy XIII still be at number 3? Probably, but maybe not. Especially if I were to account for the other games in the trilogy. Because Final Fantasy XIII 2 is kind of better than the first one, but kind of worse. The gameplay I felt was overall better, especially since you can change your leaders, and the whole monster mechanic gives you a lot more customization with your party. Especially since you can set paradigms to switch to different monsters, so you have a lot more customization there as far as your tactics and how you want to approach situations. I believe when I played through Final Fantasy XIII 2, I just used chocobos once I was far enough to have different types of chocobos, because I believe the game had 6 different chocobos, 1 for each job class. And once I was far enough to have those, I just did that. I didn't care about how good or bad certain other jobs might be, or certain other monsters might be, rather, in comparison. I was just like, I can have chocobos in my party, so I'm doing that. So that's what my team ultimately boiled down to in Final Fantasy XIII 2. Once I got far enough to start recruiting different types of chocobos. Before that, it was just kind of whatever. I had robots, miscellaneous monsters, whatever. I didn't really care. I was just kind of using whatever I thought was the most useful, or whatever fit best into my overall strategy or playstyle or whatever until I got chocobos. Then I just prioritized them above everything else. Anyway, so let's just try to get right into it at number 2. And number 2 on my list for favorite Final Fantasy games. And just a quick recap again. First of all, before we get into that blah 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 blah. Just for anybody who is joining us for the first time, the rules for this list are pretty simple. First of all, we're only counting main series games, numbers 1 through 16. And the second rule is I'm only counting the entries in the series that I have played extensively enough to formulate an actual opinion about them. There are certain Final Fantasy games that I've either never played at all, or I haven't played very extensively. Maybe I've only played a demo, or maybe only played them for a couple hours and just didn't like them. Or maybe most of my exposure is just from hearing about the game or watching friends play the game, but I myself haven't really played that particular one very extensively. And I'm not counting stuff like that. I'm only counting the Final Fantasy games that I feel I've played enough to formulate an actual legitimate opinion about them. That doesn't necessarily mean I have to have beaten the game if I just didn't like it enough to beat it. But I also have to have played it more than just like an hour or two, or played more than just a demo of the game. And of course, these are just my opinions. It's not an objective list by any means. It's not meant to be. I'm not that pretentious as to flaunt my opinions as if they're facts, like some people might do. That's the weird thing in general about objective lists, where it's just like, oh, this is just the best thing of all time, or whatever is. Ultimately, everything is going to come down to opinions. And yes, there are certain ways that you can judge something objectively and be like, this is objectively good, or it is objectively bad, or even just base it on like the consensus. Like, if most people enjoy something, then you can assume that it's top tier. But overall, I feel like making a list, especially on YouTube of all places, and treating it like it's an objective thing is a really pretentious thing to do. It's a really pretentious and arrogant approach to discussing opinions or judging things, or saying that one thing is just better than another, like it's a fact. Especially because even if it is factually better, so to speak, there's still going to be people that disagree with that fact. So really, it's not a fact. Because you can't disagree with a fact unless you're just stupid. Because a fact is a fact. And by definition, it can't be wrong. And when you're talking about things that have to do with opinions and the things that people like or dislike, treating judging something like that with facts just doesn't really work. But now that I'm done with that tangent, let's get on to the point. At number 2 on my Final Fantasy list, we have Final Fantasy V. And this is a bit of an interesting one because of what it means to me. Not in any sort of profound or emotional way, or it's not something that changed my life per se. But I have a bit of an interesting history with Final Fantasy V because when I first played it, I did not like it very much. I don't think I would go so far as to say I hate it, but I definitely got bored of the game. Oh, so far into it. I decided to come to this town before I could talk to the people. I think I just did that for the sake of the video. Normally I don't do that, but I assume I just did that either because I want to buy these spells. Maybe that was part of the reason, but I think a large part of it was because for the sake of this playthrough, I feel like I wanted to kind of showcase the game's progression as it's intended, so to speak. So I wanted to come here first to learn that this town exists for the sake of the video, rather than any other significant reason, because again, normally I don't bother coming here until I've learned the Lufenish language. So it's just kind of weird seeing me come down here, talk to the person, and then leave. Because, yeah, I already know that we can't do anything here yet. What was I saying about Final Fantasy V and how I originally didn't like it? Seeing myself walk into the town and have the people not be able to communicate with me just completely threw off my train of thought. So I'm just gonna try to start over. So Final Fantasy V, I have kind of a strange history with because when it first came out, I didn't like it. I wouldn't go so far as to say I hated the game, because I did beat it. I liked it enough to see it through to the end. But that was also partly because I was about halfway through it, more or less, before I got bored with the game. I liked it at first, but it just got boring after a while. And I don't exactly remember why, but that's because the reason for why it got boring was very shallow, and it taught me something about myself and my opinions in general. Hang on a second. All right. So I was playing the game, and I didn't care much for it, blah blah blah, and it taught me something about myself because when I was playing through the game, I was playing it on an emulator. I was playing it on my computer, and then sometime later, I don't remember how much longer this was after the fact, but at some point, I decided to try the game again. I don't exactly remember why, I just felt compelled to try the game again, and so I did, and during that playthrough, it became one of my favorite Final Fantasy games of all time, and it's been high up there ever since. And the only thing that changed was that this time I was playing the game on a console. I'm pretty sure it was the PlayStation version. It would have had to have been at that point in time. So I was playing the game on the PlayStation version and I loved it. And it made me have this realization that I don't like playing games on the computer. And that stands true to this day. It's why I basically don't use Steam at all. And if a game comes out on PC or console, I'm always going to get the console version. And if a game comes out on PC, I'll just be like, well, I'll just wait for it to come out for a system that I own, despite the fact that I have a computer. But as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't qualify, because I'm not going to play a game on the computer because I'm not going to like it as much as if I were playing it on a console. And I think a large part of that is just because if I'm sitting at a computer, I associate sitting at a computer with things like working or being at school or stuff like that. I don't associate computers with recreation. I associate computers with work and obligations and school. So if I'm sitting in front of a computer, I'm bored. I'm inherently more bored sitting in front of a computer than if I'm sitting in front of a TV. Either just watching TV or playing a video game on a video game console. Just that mentality of knowing it's a computer that I'm using versus not a computer changes how I feel about it and how much I enjoy whatever activity I'm engaged in. And it's also interesting because if I hadn't, for whatever forgotten reason, given Final Fantasy V that second chance, and had that second chance happen on a home console, my opinion of the game would be completely different to this day, I'm sure. And this list would be different. I would still be bringing the game up, I'm sure, because I had beaten it, so I had played the game enough to have an opinion about the game. But it would definitely be much lower on the list. Where would it be on the list? That's tough to say. Probably number 7 or 8? I know I would put it above Final Fantasy X and 2 for sure, despite even under those circumstances of me having not liked the game. But I'm not sure how I would really judge it compared to Final Fantasy VII or my modern opinion of Final Fantasy IV. And I say modern because, as I'm pretty sure I said during the Final Fantasy IV entry, a large part of why I rated a large part of why I rated Final Fantasy IV so low is because I've played the game to death and I'm just sick of it at this point. So I don't like the game nearly as much as I did back then, or I would like it probably if I hadn't played it so much growing up. And a number of the games on this list I've played extensively over the years, but my time with Final Fantasy IV there was literally a point where I was beating that game on a weekly basis for probably months at a time, just beating the game every single week. So it just got to the point where I just played that game to death because I just didn't own very many RPGs when I was a kid. So I didn't have that many options, but I loved playing RPGs. But it was pretty much between, especially at that point in time, I think it was pretty much between Final Fantasy IV, Mario RPG, and I think maybe Shining Force 2. Those might have been the only RPGs I owned at that particular point in time. So it was just me going back and forth between those pretty much. And I definitely liked Final Fantasy IV more than Mario RPG at that time. I loved both games, but Final Fantasy IV was definitely the favorite between those two. So when jumping between them, I would definitely go to Final Fantasy IV more frequently. So, Final Fantasy V. Let's actually discuss my thoughts about that. Starting, obviously, with the best thing about the game, which is the job system. I really like the job system in Final Fantasy V because it has a lot of diversity with what you can do, but it also doesn't go... Hang on a second. A burp was about to cut me off, so I had to stop mid-sentence. Anyway, I like Final Fantasy V's job system because it has so many options, but it doesn't go overboard. I like character customization, but I also feel like certain degrees of character customization can be a little excessive, especially if a game doesn't have enough to support its options, I want to say. A good example of that is Final Fantasy Tactics. Between the two, I prefer Final Fantasy V's job system over Final Fantasy Tactics. Yes, Tactics has much more extensive customization, but I also feel like a lot of the customization in that game is almost superfluous. It doesn't really add much of anything, and that's largely because I feel like there's a lot of skills in Final Fantasy Tactics that are just worse versions of other skills, and that I do not like that in games with customization. If I'm playing a game where I can customize my characters and my abilities, I do not like when there are certain skills that are just inherently better than others. And I mean inherently, like there's no reason to use move plus 1 over move plus 2, because move plus 2 is just better move plus 1. Yes, it's harder to learn, so move plus 2 is harder to learn, so move plus 1 is more of an early game ability, and move plus 2 is more of a mid to late game ability. Not to mention, you might not put a character in a job that will ever learn move plus 2, so move plus 1 might just be the best option for how you build up a specific character, but I still just hate that sort of dynamic where you just have one ability and then another ability that's just better version of the other ability. Final Fantasy Tactics, or not Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy V, I feel does a good job of not really having that. Yes, there are some skills that are inherently stronger than other skills, but not in the sense that they just do the same thing but better. Each skill brings something unique to the table, so you can play the game in the way that you want. What I mean is, like, let's say, let's take something like the slap ability with the samurai, assuming it works. I believe that ability is glitched in the original Super Nintendo version of the game, and I don't know which versions have that ability fixed, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's say that ability functions. And what that ability does, I believe, is you hit an enemy and it paralyzes the enemy. I don't even know if it does damage. I can't remember because I've never really used it myself. So, you hit an enemy and you paralyze them. And that's a neat ability. I don't imagine it being super useful, especially compared to just hitting the enemy and killing them. But it's an option, especially if you want to focus on crowd control. Now later on, if you continue leveling up the samurai, eventually the samurai learns a skill that insta-kills all enemies. Now, resistances aside, insta-killing an entire group of enemies is obviously better than paralyzing a single enemy. But that doesn't mean that the insta-kill is inherently a better skill. Or not necessarily inherently a better skill, but it doesn't inherently replace the slap skill. Because aside from enemies having different resistances to ailments or whatever, the two abilities do completely different things. Yes, yes, one might be stronger than the other because it kills the enemies instead of just paralyzing them. But the insta-killing doesn't inherently replace the paralyzing because they do completely different things. And but what I'm talking about is I don't like when a skill is just the exact same thing as another skill, but a better version of the other one. That kind of thing bothers me when there's character customization involved, because if I'm going to be customizing my characters with special abilities or jobs or whatever, I want every option in the game to be a viable option. Not just have some of them be good early on but become useless later, because all that's doing is restricting the customization. Even if there's more overall options available, I'm still going to consider that more restrictive because there's fewer endgame options, or fewer endgame options that make sense, or just fewer endgame options that are unique. And Final Fantasy V, I feel, does a good job of doing that. Yes, there are some abilities that are not very good, but you still have the option to use those, and they'll provide something unique to what you can do. Save for maybe one or two skills. I think there might be one or two skills in the game that effectively do the same thing. I'm not an encyclopedia on the game, so there might be some skills I'm overlooking. But my point is that when you're at the end of the game, or just going through the game, I feel like every option is more or less viable, just depending on how you want to play the game. And you're never in a situation where you feel like you're doing it wrong. You're never in a situation where one ability just outright seems like the wrong choice because there's a better version of that ability existing elsewhere, as opposed to playing the game the way you want to play, regardless of whether or not there may be a more efficient way of playing, because customizing your party isn't about finding the most efficient way to beat the game. It's about finding a way to beat the game the way that you want to play through it. Another bonus to the restrictiveness of the system is because you're so limited on how many skills you can actually have equipped at one point in time, that adds replay value, because you can't do everything in a single run. Yes, most games with customization, you can't do everything in a single run, but I feel like in a lot of RPGs, especially ones that came out later, you can do so much that there's fewer viable options for replays. Again, let's go to Final Fantasy Tactics, and you have so many abilities for so many categories, but some categories really don't have very much going for them, especially the movement category. So many of the movement categories are just different variations of movement that it's just not very interesting, you could say. Especially when you also have arguably a larger party, at least a little bit of a larger party, and you have so many abilities that just make others obsolete. There's when you can equip so many abilities, that limits the amount of abilities that you didn't use on one run that you can then try on the next run, I guess you could say. And I'm not saying Final Fantasy Tactics does a bad job of that, necessarily. It does do a good job of that. But my point is, I feel like some RPGs make it way too easy to use way too many abilities. That if you're going to replay the game, you'll have fewer options of mixing it up. Because, fewer options of mixing it up and using abilities you've never used before. Because even if the game had more abilities in total, you are able to utilize so many of them that there's fewer to use on your second run that you didn't use in the first run, as opposed to in Final Fantasy V, you're still going to wind up with a tremendous amount of abilities that you didn't even touch, just because you can actively use so few abilities at any given time. So I think the restrictions in Final Fantasy V are a good thing in that sense. They're also a good thing in the sense that you can't go overboard as far as making your characters too powerful. Yes, there are ways to get ridiculously strong, but when you can only equip like one extra ability, you can't go so crazy and become so ridiculously powerful, at least so easily. And, what am I trying to say? Basically, I'm trying to say something, but I just can't find the words to say it. Like, it's in my head, but putting it to words just isn't coming to me. But basically what I'm trying to say is, when you can't use as many skills, what is it? Like, I have it in my head. What I'm trying to say, but the words just are not coming out. Or at least the words to coherently express what I'm trying to say. Like, it's in my head as more of a feeling than actual words, and I'm being unable to think of the words to convey that thought or that feeling as words. Basically, what I'm trying to say is when you have fewer options, you're more, it's not there. Damn it. I want to say something, but it's just not coming. Maybe it'll come out as we go. Because now I just completely lost it. But, I just completely lost my train of thought. This is one reason why it's good to have another person, because I feel like if somebody else was here and I was talking with them, then we could be having a back and forth, and that would make my dialogue more natural. I would be able to be responding to them rather than trying to force stuff out without being in response to somebody else saying something. I'm just trying to force the words out and describe things without being compelled to speak in response to somebody else. And that sometimes makes it a lot more difficult to put thoughts into words. Because I'm not being compelled to say anything in response to somebody else. I'm just having to say the stuff for the sake of saying the stuff. Another thing I do like about Final Fantasy V's job system, though I keep going on about the job system, but I feel like that's the main thing to discuss with Final Fantasy V. The story is meh, and the gameplay is, like, at its core, the gameplay is good, but it could be better. Frankly, I feel like it has some weird quirks. Like the turn gauge pausing when attack animations are going off. Yes, there are other RPGs that I love that do the same thing, but I don't know, I would rather the turn gauge keep going while animations are playing. And yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that. But anyway, I was just going for the fact that I'm only discussing the job system because that's the main thing to discuss with Final Fantasy V, because that's so good that it kind of overshadows everything else, because the story is meh, the gameplay at its core, not counting the job system or anything, is just very generic. It's just a Final Fantasy game. It doesn't really do anything special to make itself stand out at its core outside of the job system and some of the unique combat scenarios, like some of the bosses. And that's another one of the things that I do really like about Final Fantasy V, which is associated with the job system, which is the difficulty. In my opinion, Final Fantasy V is the hardest of the main series Final Fantasy games. Not so much because it's necessarily a super difficult game, but because a lot of its difficulty boils down to the job system, and in turn a lot of the fun that you get out of the battles boils down to the job system. The job system doesn't just make customization fun, it also makes the battles fun, and not just because of providing the player so many options, but because of how it affects the difficulty. You can be doing one run of the game and breeze through certain bosses, but then do another run of the game and get your ass kicked, or at the very least struggle against certain bosses that were super easy the first time just because of the jobs you chose, because certain jobs will have certain synergies either with each other or will have certain distinct advantages or disadvantages against certain bosses. And you can win with pretty much any job combination. You can get by. You can overcome the challenges that the game presents you because it's balanced well enough that just about any job system can succeed in just about any situation, at least from what I've experienced. But certain situations will go very differently based on your jobs, and that makes the game a lot more fun to play, and especially to replay, because every time you play the game, you might have to come up with a completely different way to beat a boss based on your jobs. Whereas I feel like in a lot of RPGs, once you know how to beat a boss the one time, you can beat that boss the exact same way every single time, especially if the game doesn't have a job system. And Final Fantasy V does that really well, I feel like, where it has bosses that you can very easily defeat with certain jobs, but then other certain jobs will struggle against those same bosses, and it keeps the game interesting when you revisit it, because one run could be significantly easier or significantly harder, or run into hurdles at completely different points in the game based entirely on what jobs you have happened to be using. And that, I think, makes the game a lot more fun to play, because you never really know where you're going to struggle until you get to that point and run into those struggles. What else? Is there anything else to talk about with Final Fantasy V? Not that I can think of, at least not in this format. Like, I could talk about Final Fantasy V for quite a while, I'm sure. if I was just generally talking about it. But again, this format makes it kind of difficult to think about what to say because, like I just said, I don't have somebody to be talking to, so I can't be replying to somebody else's thoughts and letting the conversation flow naturally. This sort of just talking into a microphone thing without anybody physically being on the other end is a very forced form of conversation. It's not natural, it doesn't feel natural, it's very forced and awkward. And that limits the kinds of things I feel that can be discussed, so to speak. And so in this format of discussion, I feel like I'm about done with Final Fantasy V, whereas if I was actually talking with somebody, I could probably discuss Final Fantasy V for a couple hours. And I've also feel like I've discussed the main thing I love so much about it is the job system. Because again, the story isn't anything special. It's not bad. I don't hate the story, but it's not really very good. I almost feel like it's in this weird sort of limbo where it wants to be taken seriously at times, but it also doesn't want to be taken seriously at times, and it doesn't really know how to strike a good balance with that. So there are sometimes super silly moments that feel like they're trying to be serious, or super serious moments that are trying to be silly, or something. Like the part where the main villain uses a really ridiculous method of infiltrating the hero's party, and it comes off as like a super serious thing, like the game wants you to take this scene extremely seriously because of the stakes that are involved, but the manner in which it's presented and the manner in which you reach that point is so ridiculous that you can't take it seriously. And so it's just, the game doesn't know how to strike a balance with its story between silliness and serious moments. So it'll have moments where it's trying to be super serious, but you can't take it seriously. And it'll have moments that are trying to be super silly, but because of the stakes involved, or maybe some other factor, it's kind of hard to really see the humor, because realistically speaking, it's a very serious situation where humor shouldn't be involved. And then the core of the story is just kind of meh. It's not bad, but it's not extremely great either. Moving on, this has been going kind of long already, but I just want to wrap this up. So, moving on to my number one favorite Final Fantasy game, and that is Final Fantasy VI. And I also have a bit of a history with this game as well. Namely because it was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. Heck, it was the first RPG I ever played. I had never heard of games like this before. In fact, I'm sure I told this story at some point on some video. I don't know if I told it in this series though, so I'll just bring that up real quick. But when I first met my friend in 5th grade, who introduced me to RPGs, I remember him talking about the game, and I'm pretty sure he was talking about Final Fantasy VI. We were on the bus, he was telling me about this game, and he was telling me what levels his characters were at. I'd never played anything like this before. I never played a game where your characters gain levels and get stronger. The closest to an RPG I had played by this point in time was probably Zelda. Yeah, probably Zelda on the NES. So I didn't know what he meant by that. I assumed he was talking about some game, like a platformer, where you can choose different characters, kind of like in Super Mario Bros. 2. But each character progressed through the game individually. Or maybe you just chose a character at the start of the game, and he was just telling me the furthest level he'd gotten to with each character. I was not picturing something like this, where you have a party of characters, and they grow stronger by leveling up as you go. Absolutely not. That sort of thing had never even crossed my mind as something that could exist. But anyway, so one day I was at his house and he showed me the game, and I tried it out, and all it took was one battle, and ever since then, RPGs have been my favorite video game genre, specifically turn-based RPGs. I like action RPGs as well, but nah, I don't like them in the same sense because a large part of why I like RPGs is the turn-based combat. The character development aspect is fine and all, but that's not what draws me to these types of games. That's just a bonus to help keep the game more interesting when it's really long. Because by having your characters develop as you go, you're able to minimize the repetition of the gameplay. But that's not why I like RPGs. The main reason I like RPGs isn't because of the story or the character customization or whatever. It's because of the turn-based battles specifically, and the idea of having a whole party of characters that you're commanding and that you're able to succeed, and not necessarily through reflexes or quote-unquote skill, but by utilizing strategy to overcome the obstacles in your way. And that is what I fell in love with from the first time I played Final Fantasy VI. So I have a bit of a bias towards Final Fantasy VI, and I can't really say for sure if that bias affects my opinion of it at all. I can't say if Final Fantasy VI would still be my favorite Final Fantasy game if I had played a different one first. And technically, I had played Final Fantasy I first, but I never got past the party creation. I couldn't figure it out. I think I saw it and thought that was supposed to be some sort of character select screen, or maybe a stage select screen like Mega Man, and I just couldn't figure it out, so I fiddled around with the character creation for like 5 minutes and then shut the game off, decided it sucked, and then took it back outside to the garage sale so my cousin could sell the game. Because when we had garage sales when I was a kid, my aunt and my mom would have garage sales on like a yearly basis during the summer, and my cousin would oftentimes put his Nintendo games out there. And whenever I would see his Nintendo games, I would always grab them to try them out to see if I would want them, and one of them was Final Fantasy. But I just couldn't figure the game out. I couldn't figure out how to get past what I assumed was a character select or a stage select screen. So I don't really count that. As far as I'm concerned, the very first Final Fantasy I ever actually played was Final Fantasy VI. And my thoughts for Final Fantasy VI can be sort of tied into Final Fantasy VII, because Final Fantasy VI has the Esper system, which I like significantly more than the Materia system, because your characters actually learn the spells themselves. Yes, each character is kind of cookie cutter when it comes to the spells because every character can learn every spell, but at least the characters themselves are learning the magic, as opposed to Final Fantasy VII, where all you're really doing is strengthening rocks that you can that are interchangeable between the characters. Not only that, but each character also has their own unique abilities to make them stand out that only they can do. One of my least favorite things about RPGs is when you have cookie-cutter characters that are just blank slates, that have nothing distinguishable about themselves. Yes, Final Fantasy V sort of falls into that category, but not really, because yes, they all start out that way, but eventually the characters become what you want them to be based on how you customize them with their jobs. And you can't level up one character as a knight and have another character reap those benefits, because only the first character trained as a knight. So each character starts off super generic and super plain, but they become what you want them to be throughout the game. And they become individualized based on that. Whereas something like Final Fantasy VII, they're just so generic. Yes, they have their limit breaks, but those you can only use very seldomly anyway, so that's a very minor thing as far as something to make each character unique. So Final Fantasy VI, though, each character has their own unique ability. So, and I appreciate that. So yes, it's generic in that everybody can use the same spells and everything, but again, you're choosing which spells you want certain characters to learn. And you can just choose not to learn spells. You can also choose to use espers to build up your stats. And I never do that. I basically just completely ignore the stat level ups when it comes to the espers because that game is so stupidly easy. And growing up, I never paid attention to that at all. And now when I play the game, I know I can get through the game just fine while ignoring that feature, so I just ignore it. I just focus on learning spells. But even then, I don't really use magic very often in Final Fantasy VI. I prefer to have the characters fight using their own abilities. I just learn the spells as a just in case. Just in case I need them to have certain spells, or just in case I need Sabin or Shadow to be healing somebody, or stuff like that. Here's the weird thing. I feel like Final Fantasy VI, discussing Final Fantasy VI is the hardest to discuss, largely because I honestly feel like a lot of my opinion just is that bias. Not because I think the game is average and I only like it for that reason. The story is great. The main boss is just a better version of the main boss from Final Fantasy VII. The Esper system is just a better version of the Materia system from Final Fantasy VII. I could go on and on about comparing Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy VI, but that's just because I feel like that's the main argument. So many people, when it comes to the best Final Fantasy game, it always comes down to Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII, that whenever I think about discussing Final Fantasy VII, the immediate things that come to mind are all the things that I feel Final Fantasy VI does better than 7. And that boils down to just about everything. Because I like the overall story better. I like the characters more. The characters have more depth. They matter more. So many of the characters in Final Fantasy VI play pivotal roles in the story to the point that the game almost doesn't even really have a main character. If you had to say there's a main character, it would be Terra, yes, but each character plays such a significant role in the story that it almost feels like there isn't really a main character. Every character is important. And I also like that dynamic. because it never feels like certain characters are thrown under the bus. Not really thrown under the bus, but like they're neglected in a way that they don't feel very important. Aside from a couple characters who don't really matter very much, like Mog and Umaro, those characters just kind of exist, and certain characters definitely have more story beats than others. Somebody like Gao, for example, yes, he has a backstory, and there are 1 or 2 quests involving him, and learning more about who he is, where he came from, and all that stuff. But he doesn't get nearly as much attention as somebody like Cyan, for example. And then you have other characters like Shadow, who you have to go through a bunch of cryptic side quests to really learn a whole lot about, or a lot of their story is hidden in subtext or very subtle hints throughout the game, either by body language or just how certain characters react in certain moments, or even just things like item descriptions that might give you a little bit more insight into one thing or another. And I feel like that's it, honestly. I don't know, Final Fantasy VI is my favorite game in the series. But I also feel like it's difficult to talk about because, I don't know, I feel like a lot of the reasons for why I like Final Fantasy VI are a lot simpler than the other Final Fantasy games. Like, it has a great battle system. It's really immersive. It has a lot of very interesting bosses with unique and interesting mechanics. Every boss feels very different and unique. They have a lot of mechanics. Like, there's the story. The story is great. There's a lot of great characters, a lot of great moments, a lot of great character development and progression. The Esper system is great for learning spells or customizing the growth of your characters, and you kind of have the option of doing either of those or both of those. I like how even though you can customize the magic of your characters, you still have that individuality with the characters because they all have their own unique abilities. So, none of the characters ever feel generic, even though you have that full spectrum of customization. The game gives you enough customization that you feel like you have options for how you develop your characters, but at the same time, each character also has something unique to them that makes them stand out, so they don't just all feel like blank slates, like in something like Final Fantasy V or Final Fantasy VII, for example. It's a nice mix of it's a nice mix. The characters are a nice mix of Final Fantasy IV, in that they're all unique individuals as far as what they bring to the table, but at the same time, it's also very much like Final Fantasy V, where they're all, or more like Final Fantasy VII, but it's also a lot like Final Fantasy VII, where they're blank slates that you can customize with the spells and abilities and stat growth that you want. I feel like Final Fantasy VI is the best of both Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VII when it comes to the characters and their growth and their utility in battle and their customization. It's the best of both of those games put together while cutting out the worst of those games. Not only that, but I also really like how the Magicite also serves as summon magic. So even when you're using the espers to learn new spells or develop your stats however you want, you also can use them as summons, so even the espers or the magicites themselves have their own individuality. That is something that you could say the materia doesn't have. And it's something that I feel like most games really don't have, that use that kind of system of equipping certain things and getting benefits from them. Is you also have that, so there's further customization with that. You can say, screw learning spells or screw what stats I gain. I just want this particular character to be able to summon this particular esper, and so just give them that magicite and not worry about anything else. So you also have that option. That's another option, another way to play the game, either with one or two characters or with several. You could just have Terra be your big magic user, just learning all the spells that you need just to blow enemies away. Then you could give Locke. You could just take Locke and be like, I don't really want him casting magic, so I'll just give him a magicite that boosts his strength every level up, so he could just be dealing massive damage with his sword. Then you could throw in someone like Shadow, who has really high speed, and maybe give him an esper like Phantom to make your party invisible at the start of the battle for support, and then just have him start hitting stuff with his daggers or katanas or whatever his weapons are supposed to be, or just throwing shurikens. There's a lot of customization there, and how much you want to rely on magic versus how much you want to rely on each character's unique abilities, and either is viable. In fact, usually when I play through the game, aside from characters who are catered to magic in the story, like Celeste and Terra, I use a lot of magic with them. But usually, I don't use much magic with the other characters. Like, even someone like Edgar, his tools kind of fall off as you get further into the game, but I would still rather use the auto crossbow to hit an entire group of enemies at the end of the game in the final dungeon, versus just blasting that entire group of enemies with a Fire 3 spell, just because I like to maintain that individuality of the characters while having magic as an option, just in case I do need it. And that's why I really like the customization in Final Fantasy VI, because, like I said, and I literally just came up with that comparison off the top of my head while discussing this, but I really do think that when it comes to the party and character customization, that Final Fantasy VI is the best of both Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VII, where you have your characters who are specialized in their own unique abilities, but then you also have the customization aspect when it comes to your magic and actual character growth when you level up. Especially because I think in Final Fantasy VI, you don't really gain very many stats from levels. You get some hit points and magic points, and you do get stronger because I think your level itself somehow calculates into things like damage. But I don't think stats like strength or speed or magic ever actually increase unless you have a magicite equipped that boosts those stats when you level up. So you have full customization in that regard. But even then, certain characters do inherently have certain stats that are higher than others. So certain characters are catered towards specific types of builds, but you can change that if you want. You could turn Mog into a beefcake if you really wanted to. So yeah, that's Final Fantasy VI, I guess. I feel like I should be able to talk a lot longer about Final Fantasy VI since it is my favorite. But again, I just don't know where to begin, basically. Or I don't know how to. I feel like I could just keep going on and on and on, but I would just start repeating myself. I feel like I should be able to say a lot more about the game, but again, just, I don't know. It's my favorite one. It's an opinion, so it's not like I have to justify it in a way that will change your mind. And if there's any uncertainties about it, you can always bring those up with the comments. And we can discuss it further from there, because as I said earlier in this very video, it's a lot easier to discuss something when I'm responding to somebody else rather than talking to nobody. Before we wrap this up though, I would like to conclude this with one of the stories from my list. I actually kind of wanted to start telling the stories as we go, as I was discussing the games and my thoughts on the games, but that just kind of started not really happening, or I kept forgetting, or just whatever. But it just came to mind, I actually do have a story from my list. For those of you who have been here since in earlier episodes, in some of the earlier episodes I was going through various stories from my history with the Final Fantasy series, just personal experiences and whatnot over my life that involved Final Fantasy. And one of the more unusual ones was in Final Fantasy VI, where sometimes I would go on an adventure with a single character and see how long I could last without healing. It was just a weird thing I like to do sometimes. I did a lot of weird stuff in games when I was younger. I could be more easily entertained. I didn't have to just be making progress in the game or working towards the goal to be enjoying a game. Sometimes I could just do weird, silly stuff and just have fun. And sometimes that was what I would do in Final Fantasy VI. I would take one character, remove everybody else from the party, and then I would choose a starting point with the airship and then just kind of wander around the world. Maybe even go off to areas that I maybe normally wouldn't, because that area doesn't really serve any actual purpose. Maybe walking through a forest or down to a peninsula or something, some sort of area that on the map you never actually have a reason to pass through. And I would just explore. And the whole idea would just be to see how long I can last without resting. I could use healing spells and stuff like that, but I don't think I would allow myself using any items. And I also wouldn't use any tents especially, or rest at any inns. I would just keep going and basically see how long I could last before I got a game over. Just a silly little thing I used to do that I think would be worth sharing. Do I have my stories notes somewhere? Are they right here? Let me check something. My disinterest in, I actually did unwittingly tell one of the stories, which was my disinterest in, well, that Final Fantasy V made me realize my disinterest in PC games. I was just looking at my list. That was another one of the stories on my list that I hadn't discussed. So that also works. I'm not 100% sure if we'll come back to the list of stories from my history with Final Fantasy. I would like to, just for maybe a short topic of discussion, but there are one or two other things I really want to get done first. And part of the reason I took a break from the stories was because I wanted to get some very specific things done, hopefully before we beat this game, and this top 10 was one of them. And there's a couple other things as well that I think are more important, or at least one other thing that I think is more important to discuss. We're coming up to the end of this dungeon, though. So I almost feel like it's worth just keeping going. Just keep this train rolling until we've beaten this dungeon. Hopefully, the video footage won't run out by then because of how I have this playing back. When I'm recording these, I have a singular file, sort of, that's the entire recording of this game, but that makes it really difficult to pick back up exactly where I left off. So usually how I will do this is I'll edit the video, I'll edit an episode of this game, then I will put that into my video editing software and use that to kind of set the cutoff point. And I'll put that against the singular file that's just the entire game. That's just the singular recording of the entire game. And I will use that, and I will use the episode as to find the cutoff point. And then from there, I'll render about an hour and a half of the raw footage to then watch when I'm recording these. And I do it that way instead of just watching it back in the video editing software, because the video editing software causes so much lag on my computer that wouldn't be very reliable. It's much more reliable to just have the video file and watch it back. And if I did it with the whole thing, then it would be very difficult to know where to pick back up for the next episode. So I do it like that. So here we are at the end. We come upon the orb. We heal up. Let's heal up for this boss battle. This is the point in the game, though, where things get really easy. Like, look how many potions we still have because of things like the heal staff. This is really starting to accentuate why I don't like the second half of this game, because the resource management just gets flung out the window at this point because of all the magical items you acquire being way too strong. The Fiend's ball is shattered, evaporating all the water. And then he says some stuff. He introduces himself as Kraken. I kind of gave up on actually reading the thing because I wasn't sure how much time I would have to actually read it, since I'm watching this back instead of playing the game live. So Red is going to be powering himself up, Blue's attacking, I missed what White's doing. Probably setting something up, and Black is going to cast Slow to try and slow down Kraken because Kraken's basic attacks hit a ton of times. They can do a lot of damage. Okay, anti-ice. I don't remember if Kraken actually uses ice magic though. I tend to forget what attack spells some of these bosses actually use. Okay, he's using ink, which can blind the party. He's slowed though, so that alone gets rid of a lot of the threat, because his basic attacks can hit for a tremendous amount of damage just because of how many times they hit. But if you can slow him and bring his hit count down to 1 because of that, then he becomes real crappy. Blind failed, invisibility to complement bringing his attacks down. He's trying to blind again. Red got blinded, so that's very unfortunate. Fortunately, blind isn't too devastating in this game. It's annoying, but it's not nearly as bad as being slowed. I think blind matters more earlier in the game. than later on. Cast fast on blue so blue can just wreck his shit, especially with that crit. Red's still doing some damage. Yeah, only 22 because he only hit once. But if I hadn't slowed him, he could have hit like 8 times and probably done a couple hundred damage. And if he hits your mages with his basic attack especially, then they'll get wrecked. He could probably one-shot Black if he attacked him with his standard move. He's using a lot of ink. He's not really dishing out much damage, so this is going very smoothly. 9 hits for 250 damage. Heal up. Again, the heal staff just being way too powerful. It doesn't heal very much, but just the fact that you can use it infinitely takes away so much of the challenge from this game, because like 80% of the difficulty in the original Final Fantasy is the resource management and trying to survive through the dungeons with your limited resources. But when you can infinitely heal yourself, you lose so much of that. And it really starts to accentuate why I much prefer the first half of this game. Sometimes I don't even feel like doing the second half. I'll do it just for the sake of finishing the game because I already got that far. But sometimes I'll play this game literally just to do the first half. But once I get up to the Castle of Ordeals and start getting all this stupidly powerful stuff, I really do think the game just becomes a whole lot worse. Just because you have way too powerful of tools at your disposal. And yes, the enemies do become stronger as well, but they don't become stronger enough to compensate for you having those tools, because I feel like the game's difficulty is balanced more in a way to expect you to not be using those, or not necessarily expect you to not be using them, but it's balanced in a way that it's like just in case you're not using them, or just in case you didn't find them, or decided to sell a particular piece of gear. The game is designed so that it's perfectly beatable without that stuff. But in doing so, it becomes way too easy when you do have that stuff, especially in any other version of this game where you have such an unrestricted inventory system. And if I was playing any other version of this game, I could be using the heal staff every single turn. Because if I needed white to be doing something else, I could have someone else use the heal staff instead. But in this case, it's less exploitative because of that. Or the power gauntlet on red. I had to choose between having the power gauntlet on him or the opal gauntlet, and the opal gauntlet gives better stats, but the power gauntlet allows him to strengthen himself. I had to make that choice. I couldn't have him equipped with the opal gauntlet while having him still being able to power himself with the power gauntlet, or I can't have red use the power gauntlet one turn and then blue use the power gauntlet the next turn, thereby abusing the gear in a way that is not meant to be used, like you can in every other version of this game. It's my biggest contention with future versions of this game is that no other version other than the original NES one has the inventory system right. But I'm pretty sure that's something I discussed at another point in time in this series. It's just nice to be able to bring it up again now that it's relevant and we're at the point of the game where that information actually matters. But with that said, our time today is definitely done. We've completed our countdown list. Next time we'll have to go on to a completely different subject. But until then, you know what to do, because this is probably not the first YouTube video you've ever watched. So you know all the things, blah blah blah, you're probably sick of hearing about them. And I'll see you next time.
Actually, before we conclude this video, one aspect of Final Fantasy VI that I do really love came to mind while editing, so let's go over that real quickly. Not only does each party member have their own unique abilities to make them stand out as individuals in combat, but many of those abilities also implement entirely unique gameplay mechanics. Whether they have unique ways of expanding their arsenals, like buying new tools for Edgar or mastering new dances with Mog, or they utilize mechanics beyond just clicking menus like with Sabin's button inputs or Cyan's charge up gauge, each character not only provides unique abilities, but also unique forms of playing them. Adding some excellent variety to the gameplay not only with the tactical options they provide, but how those options are used from a gameplay perspective. I just wanted to squeeze this in here real quick, so that I don't have to worry about forgetting to bring it up come the next video. Anyway, thanks for watching.